Welcome to Ventura's Leading Edge, a show about leaders making an impact on Ventura's most pressing challenges. I'm your host, James Perero. Today we're talking with Nicholas Deitch. Nick is a senior principal at Main Street Architects and Planners and teaches architectural graphics at Ventura College. He served for many years as the board president of Turning Point Foundation and currently serves on the board of directors for the Ventura Chamber of Commerce. Nick is also a writer and, in my view, a visionary who works to help others envision a better future, one just beyond where we are today, filled with promise and achievable. Nick, thanks for being here today. I really appreciate your coming in.
Thank you, James. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So, how would you? Let's dive right in. Let's talk about leadership. How would you define leadership? What to you is the hallmark of or sort of the essence of leadership?
For me, I guess it's fundamentally about helping the people around me that I'm working with be the best they can be and do the best work they can do. And so how do I do that? I try to encourage and listen and demonstrate by example. Listening is huge for me, and it's something that it's not natural. It doesn't come natural to men, I think, to listen well.
That's certainly the rap.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of truth to it. And as I've become more conscious of my own listening habits, I've also tried to help people in our office be aware. For example, it's very common for people to listen to try to figure out how to respond while the question is being asked.
Right.
And what happens is we're not hearing with the intent to hear the question. We're actually more concerned about how we're going to respond and how we're going to be right in responding. And my observation is that when people, often in my environment, and architecture is a complicated profession, the rules are changing constantly, the technology is changing constantly. When someone is asking a question, often the question is about formulating their own understanding of what it is they're asking. The question itself is part of their learning process. So if I interrupt that, I'm basically usurping the process of their learning, of their trying to articulate what they're working through. And what I find is that it takes their power away, and ultimately leaves someone feeling kind of incapacitated. That you start to tell them what it is they're asking before they finished asking. You're not hearing the question. You're also, I think, missing out on an opportunity to learn yourself, because there might be something in that question that takes you to another place. So that's something I work on a lot, and I've got my team conscious about it and trying to work on it as well.
Is that something that's always been a feature of your personality, or do you feel like that's something that you've developed over time as you've matured and learned more about leadership or your own relationship, I guess, habits?
Yeah, good question. I think, in all honesty, my wife has been one of my great teachers in that regard, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. Men are problem solvers. We want to fix things. Women process information differently and respond differently. Very often when my wife, or I have two daughters, when they've come to me with problems, my basic response is to jump to the fix. What you should do. Here's how to fix that. Here's how to take care of it. Instead of letting them articulate and finish what it is they're trying to ask. And sometimes people are asking questions more to hear the question than they are to hear the answer.
Sure.
So it's not something that I think is inherently part of my being. It's been something I've had to learn and work around and observe in myself, and I still do it. Phone, when I sit at the table with someone for lunch, my cell phone does not come out of my pocket if I can at all help it. And that's been a great bane, I think, for all of us. There's nothing sadder to me than seeing a couple sitting at a table at dinner and one of them has their cell phone in their hands. I know
exactly what you're talking about. Or both of them have their cell phones in their hands.
It's tragic. It's tragic. And not that it isn't a valuable tool, but there's a place for the one-on-one and the connection and the listening, and the technology is definitely creating a little bit of a barrier there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I find it interesting that listening is the sort of the first theme that comes to at least your mind or maybe your response when I ask about leadership. Because I think often when people think about leadership, they think about somebody who has answers and is articulating direction and is telling people what to do and is directive in disposition. And that doesn't necessarily imply or suggest a posture of listening. So, in fact, I think some people would think that listening is really a passive, non-active activity. So what would you say to somebody who thinks that listening is not necessarily compatible with effective leadership?
I think if I'm not understanding the problem, I'm going to have a very hard time leading people through it. And if I come to the table and I've got it all figured out and I know exactly what needs to be done, okay, let's get going. Let's do it. Usually isn't set up that way. The projects that we work on are complex, challenging. The listening begins when I meet with a client and I hear what it is they're trying to accomplish. Now, I have worked with architects who don't listen. They've got it figured out. And there are architects who have made a very good living by telling the clients what they want, not listening to what the client wants. And the clients often go to those architects because they've seen their work and that's what they want. So they go there and say, please give me one of those, and the architect will do that. I've never worked that way. I'm interested in the people I'm working with and in the goals of the people I'm working with. And that's true in my firm, in the community, in my family, in the volunteer work that I do. I don't come to the table with all the answers. I come with an inquisitive mind, wanting to understand and figure out. I'm very good at problem solving. I'm very good at listening to challenging circumstances and issues and ferreting through them to find a path that people can get interested in and behind. And so I do have that quality, but I can't get there by myself. I can't get there without listening and understanding what the broader goals are.
And that topic of goals, I think, touches on the question of vision. So certainly when somebody comes to you with a project, they're going to have a goal in mind for what they want to accomplish. And it may not, vision may not really be the right word for it. And when I think of leadership and vision, I think of, certainly it's related to the idea of a goal, but it's sort of painting a picture of where the leader's going or the team is going. So how do you, as a listener, how do you communicate, convey, and develop vision that works for your team, and I guess brings your team, I guess, in line with the goals of what your clients are?
Let me preface all of this by saying I'm not a rich architect. I'm not out there making tons and tons of money. The way a lot of architects do that is by repeating the solution over and over again. You get very good at it, very efficient at it, and commoditize it. Yes, right. I don't do that. I don't do that well, and it's not fun. I get bored easily. So the challenge is that every project is unique. Every client is unique. All the goals are different. There are, of course, projects that are similar. We focus a lot on housing, affordable housing, and infill projects and mixed use. And there are certainly similar parameters and code requirements. But even so, each site presents a unique context, unique financial concerns, right. Unique historical influences. So repeating the same thing over and over again for us doesn't work well and isn't the path to success as we measure success. And for us, success is about creating something that when it's done feels like it belongs there, that it fits, that it's completing a larger piece of the puzzle. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the questions precisely, but I think that when we sit down to examine a project, we're listening with our ears, we're listening with our eyes, looking at the context, looking at the factors that the project has to address. And for me, it is about finding the right solution for that particular set of problems. And of course, in architecture, the response, the articulation of the vision is not merely verbal. It's also very graphic. So there's a lot of hand drawing and ultimately computer work. But initially, for me, it's hand drawing, which is becoming a rarer commodity. But
I would expect.
But actually, it's what I teach at Ventura College, because I still believe that it's very critical to the creative process. So that articulation of vision can be very graphic at times, very pictorial as well. So it's not just a bunch of words. It's like this, and showing people. In fact, I start this class that I teach. The first day of class, we talk about why it's still valuable to know how to draw with your hands if you're going to be in the creative profession. And there's a spontaneous kind of dialogue between brain and hand that the computer can interrupt, can get in the way of. Especially some of the software that's used for architectural purposes is very rigid on a lot of levels. And students, especially before they've developed the skills of design and creativity, if they start working on a computer, they're going to get locked in very quickly to hardline, straight-edge stuff.
Interesting.
And frankly, takes the spirit out of the process, takes that energy out of the process. The hand drawing is very spontaneous. We do a lot of quick sketching in the class, 3 to 5 minutes to look at an image and draw it. And it's all about taking what's in your mind and putting it out in a form that someone can look at and say, oh, I understand what you're thinking.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing, to be able to tell a story to someone and let them visualize what it is that's in your mind. That's quite an achievement.
And do you find that it's difficult to get students to push past the impulse to create something that's clean or perfect the first time around?
Definitely. We don't do a very good job of encouraging messiness and the creative process and the inherent messiness that comes with exploration.
There's a certain openness, right? And it strikes me that's similar to the idea of approaching a problem from a listening perspective. Mm-hmm. It's coming in and allowing something to sort of be what it is, taking a moment to observe it, evaluate it, before deciding kind of what it is and what to do with it, before you judge or evaluate what that is, right? So similar with, I would think with a hand-drawn sketch, you kind of have to let it be what it is in its imperfectness and let that speak kind of what it does and look for what's in that has either value or vision or sort of identify what it is that the author or the artist is trying to communicate.
Sure. And in fact, in the design process, it's very common to have, in a period of 3 minutes, 4, 5, 6, 7 sketches, overlays on top of each other, evolving.
Interesting.
Almost like animation in a way. Very common to do that. Because it's this iterative process and it's evolving before your eyes as you work through it.
Yeah.
It's really one of the great passions for me of being a part of the profession of architecture. And as you're saying that, it's making me also think that on a broader scale, one of the challenges we have is that we have codes and we have social expectations about what buildings should be and how they should behave. And that the general tendency is to try to define how buildings should behave in our culture, in our community, in a way that actually inhibits the creative process, because we really set up rules that say, here's how things should go. We see this in communities where the safety realm is beige stucco and red tile roof, and if you do that, we'll be okay with it.
It'll get approved.
And it will, and people won't complain too much. And it's a realm of safety. It's also very artificial.
And maybe a little bit boring.
A little boring, and ultimately what happens is that we remove the risk of having the outlandish at the expense of having the outlandish and the wonderful and the amazing. And so we have this realm of mediocrity that we live in and drive around in and spend our time in. And it's unfortunate.
It is.
I think Ventura's less trapped in that realm than many communities, but we still push against it some.
Sure.
And it's okay as long as we can have the dialogue about it. And frankly, I'm in the middle of that right now on a number of projects that I think we're going to see interesting dialogue over the next several months in that regard.
Well, if you're just joining us, my guest is Nick Deitch. You're listening to Ventura's Leading Edge on KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM CAPS Radio. Well, Nick, I'd like to talk a little bit about pressing challenges facing Ventura. And before you came in today, I asked you to reflect a little bit on that. So I'm wondering, what do you think in your mind? And I know there could be a number of things, a number of ways this question could be answered. But if you had to identify one pressing challenge, what would that be?
Well, as most people who live in Ventura know, change here happens very slowly and with a lot of resistance. And the term slow growth gets used a lot. And slow growth is not necessarily a bad thing. I think we all have observed communities that have changed very rapidly and not necessarily for the better. So it isn't as much the pace of the growth as it is how clear we are about what it is we want to become. We're in the process constantly of becoming. It's never going to get finished. One of the things I like to do in my class is ask my students, what do you think Ventura is going to look like 500 years from now?
What a fantastic question.
It's fascinating to me. What is Ventura going to look like 500 years from now?
I mean, I feel challenged by what's it going to look like in 10 years.
Yeah.
And
here's the thing. 500 years from now, it will be a very different place. I hope that we would be able to walk around and identify things like, oh, there's the mission. I remember that building. I'm projecting myself into the future.
Course, yeah.
I do this probably too often. But 500 years from now, it won't just appear and be different. It's going to be a result of incremental change from now to then. And we're in the midst of it. We're doing it. We're creating change on a daily basis. How much of that change is conscious? How much of it have we asked ourselves, what is it we want 10 years from now? What is it we want 20 years from now?
Right.
Because everything that we're doing is incrementally bringing us to those places in the future. It's an ongoing story. And it's fascinating and it's wonderful, and we shouldn't be afraid of it.
So would you argue that, because there are people who would say, how it is now works and it's great. Let's not mess it up by changing it. But I would think that because of the passage of time, there's sort of an inherent change that occurs over time. And I'm not just talking about deterioration of physical structures, or need for maintenance, but that something is happening as we are moving forward through time in the space where we live. Even if we are not wanting to change the buildings or things around us, there is sort of an inexorable process that is at work. It may not necessarily be dramatic or visible on a shorter time scale, especially if there's a resistance to putting in, say, new buildings. But it seems like there's the idea that we're not going to change things is sort of ignoring some kind of a fundamental reality.
Sure. And say that to a Chumash Indian. We aren't going to change things. The Padres, when they first got here, don't worry, we're just building just one building here. We're not going to change anything.
Okay.
No. This change has been going on since at least since the late 1700s. And all you have to do is drive from downtown Ventura to East Ventura, and what you will see is an urban archaeology of change over the decades as the community moved further and further eastward. And you can see in the downtown was developed between 1880 to 1900 on into 1930, 1940. It was very pedestrian-oriented. Cars were not dominant in the life of Venturans at that time.
Right.
So parking is limited. The streets are walkable. As you move further east, you get into territory that is more and more car-centric. And this particularly happens past 5 Points. But even before then, you see where buildings were, there was a Sears built. There was a Sears downtown. Then it was built in the Midtown. That's where Smart and Final is now. That was a Sears department store.
Okay.
And it had a much bigger parking lot. They moved there because they could build more parking, because in the 1940s, 1950s, cars were becoming quite prevalent. Then, of course, later they moved to the mall, and now you have a massive parking lot, and you have the building in the center of that. So my point being that we've been continually changing, and to think that we're not going to change anymore, it would be extremely naive. And I would argue that we need to change, that Ventura is not perfect. It's far from perfect. I would love to live in a community where I could ride my bike without risk of losing my life. I don't live in a community like that.
Yeah.
This is not a safe place to be a bicyclist. Right. And that's terribly unfortunate, because there are a lot of people in this community, I think, that enjoy that and would benefit from being able to ride their bikes in different places. Now, how do we do that? That would require significant alteration of some of our main corridors to create separate bike paths. It can be done, and it's being done in communities all over. The other part of it is that as we drive through the community today, it's very common that we don't see a lot of things. 70% of our developed land in Ventura is set aside for storing cars. We drive through it.
Did you say 70%?
70% of the land in Ventura that's developed is set aside for parking.
I had never considered that the percentage was that high.
Get on Google Earth and take a look.
That's stunning.
It is stunning.
When you actually put it in terms like that.
And we don't see it. We just drive through it.
Right.
So Google Earth's a wonderful tool to look at these things. If you take the shopping center where Winco is now,
oh sure, that's a huge lot.
It's a huge parking lot.
Right.
The town of Dubrovnik, this beautiful historic town, fits on that piece of land.
That really says a lot about what you can do with a small space, and about how much space we waste. It's a luxury that we have in a country that's as large as ours is.
It's a luxury, but I would actually say that it's really a devastation. In all honesty, the car probably has been the most significant negative impact on our culture, on our health, on the way we live and experience life. And so what we've done is, cars are awesome, right? You buy a new car. Oh my gosh, you get into the thing and it's just wonderful. It's a little capsule. And you roll the windows up and it's quiet.
Right.
And it's got an amazing stereo system. And it practically drives itself. So you don't have to deal with any of that crap that's outside of the car.
Right.
You can go anywhere and you're safe and cool in your little capsule. And then what that means is our world can be crap, and it doesn't really matter, because I'm going to go from my house to my job, and I don't really care what I'm passing. I just got to get there as fast as I can.
Because I'm in a capsule that's
I'm in
as
a really
nice
cool,
as I can afford.
Yeah.
So let me ask, it's a long prelude to the original question. What would you say is the greatest challenge facing Ventura?
The greatest challenge is also the greatest opportunity, and that is learning how to become urbane. And in order to do that, we're going to need an economic strategy that makes sense, that helps us retain young professionals and young people. We're going to need to redefine what our housing looks like, because we're not going to be building a lot more single-family houses.
Yeah, there's no space.
And as I'm answering this, recognize that the city's growing at a rate of 1% per year, in population. That's the baseline growth that the city's experienced over the last 40 years. 1% per year. And this is true pretty much for the whole county. This is happening on some level. But again, I don't see it as a negative. I see it as an opportunity for us to create places that people can be and can coexist. And I see it as more culture, as more energy, as more dynamic community. It's not a negative in my view.
And let me ask, in the limited time that we've got left, what sort of leadership would it take to make that, to realize the opportunity that you see there?
It's going to take people who are willing to ask questions that they don't necessarily understand or have the answers to. We're back to the beginning. It's going to take people who are willing to listen, to understand the challenges that we're facing, to understand that the leader, the person who's in the leadership role, doesn't necessarily represent the norm of the community. That they may have what they need and want, but that's not necessarily what the others in the community need and want. There are a lot of people who would choose not to live in a mixed-use urban setting, and I get that. They would prefer to have their single-family home or something in a less urban context. But there are people who would be very pleased and grateful to live in one of those more walkable urban settings. And there's no reason why a community like Ventura can't have a mix of those things. And there's a vision for the community that does begin to describe that. Our general plan talks about it some, about the idea of creating walkable pedestrian districts and nodes throughout the community. Ideally, from my view, those occur along some of the main corridors, and they're connected by transit, because ultimately, one of the answers to reducing our parking problem and making it more bike-friendly in this community is to get people to use transit. Malls are changing.
Sure.
And the purpose of malls is changing. And we have this amazing piece of property in the middle of our Midtown area
right.
that is going to change over the next 30 years. What's that look like? What should happen there? There are a number of pieces of property like that throughout the community that have worked for what they were in the last 40 years, but the next 20 years or so, their purpose is going to shift. What does that look like? What do we want from those places? The Johnson Drive area has struggled since day one. River Park comes along and the collection gets built, and we lose our theaters.
Right.
So interestingly, therein is a huge opportunity. How do we, instead of piecemealing that thing and trying to patch it, let's rethink it. Let's do something with Johnson Drive that is remarkable, that is a complement to what's going on over at River Park. It's really a subset. You know, just because there's a political boundary between the two things doesn't mean there needs to be a social boundary between them.
And so what would you say to somebody who wanted to be involved in producing the kind of change that you're talking about? What steps could your average Venturan take to be involved in helping realize the kind of opportunities that you're seeing for our community?
That's a tough question. I don't know how much the average Venturan wants to deal with that stuff. There are unique Venturans who are really concerned about it and very passionate about it. And I would suggest to get involved in the dialogue, you've got to be passionate about it. You've got to really want to delve into it. Now, ideally, and we've done this in the past, the community has had a number of opportunities for community dialogue and workshops. And in those workshops, pretty much anybody can go and listen and participate and share their views. Every 10 years, we have to retool and update our general plan. The last time we did it seriously was at the end of the 90s, where we had very significant community workshops, a lot of community participation, and a resulting vision that came out of that is still in force right now. And now these documents are available online from the city. It takes some interest and some passion to delve into them and sift through them. But there's a document called the Ventura Vision Document, which is a very accessible document. It's not full of planarese. It's written with good old plain ordinary English, and it talks about our healthy city, our social city, our recreational city, our economically viable city. It has all these different components to it about how Venturans visioned our community 15 years ago. How much has that changed or evolved? And it should continue to evolve. So there is an opportunity in this process for the community to participate. We have to make sure that the civic leaders recognize the need to do that and are open to supporting that effort, and I believe they are. I know that the city staff is supportive of that process.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me this afternoon and share your thoughts on Ventura. I really appreciate your insight and perspective. I think the listening approach that you take to leadership is a good lesson for all of us to remember and think about as we're contemplating change and complexity.
My pleasure, James.
Well, my guest today has been Nicholas Deitch, architect, teacher, writer, friend to many. For more engaging dialogue about leadership and how local leaders are impacting Ventura's most pressing challenges, tune in next time to Ventura's Leading Edge.